Today, I'm going to talk about the issue of focal length. I always think that focal length is a very interesting topic. Why? I've talked before in the episode of framing and composition that focal length is a very important factor for framing. It frames the content, the story, and what we want to show to our audience. And of course, focal length here must be one of the most crucial factors. The choice of different focal length and how do we use it. But the strange is, when we shoot photos or take videos, we will actively or cautiously use the setting of exposure triangle. For example, adjust the aperture, ISO, shutter speed, or sometimes the white balance. But concerning the focal length, it seems we rarely focus or target on a specific focal length, or there is certain content of which must be presented by unique focal length. It seems not many people will really care about this. But sure that when we are using a prime lens, we started to concern the use of focal length. However, when we use a zoom lens, most of the time we just treat it as a lens for magnify or magnify purpose, just for convenience. Since most of the time when we film, we mostly just focus on the size of our subject. So the focal length is just using for fitting our desired size of the subject. And there is no intention of us to use certain unique focal length. Is it okay? Sure, I wouldn't say no. Since no matter of the reasons for we shoot, it should be happy and fun for us. So actually, it's no big deal if we are not concerning with the use of focal length. Nevertheless, I still want to share that if we can know more about the usage of different focal length, maybe we can have more fun and enhance a bit of our filming skills. I think most of us have learned something about focal length. Nonetheless, I will still briefly talk about it. Focal length is, of course, a certain length. So what kind of length is it? It is the length from the convergence point of the lens to the film or sensor. Of course that your lens is quite big in size, and it is composed of many different lenses in size. So the convergence point may not be at the last piece of lens. And concerning these convergence points, unless you read the manual, we won't know where it is located. It doesn't matter. What we have to know is the focal length is started measuring from the convergence point of the lenses to the film or the sensor of the camera. And finally, the distance is the focal length. And what a specific focal length does tell us. We make a cross from the sensor to the convergence point, and then the cross extends and forms the angle of view. Finally, it is this focal length that gives us the correlated viewing angle. Basically, it's the width of the viewing. And develops from this principle, the shorter the focal length, the bigger of the angle of the cross. And of course, the wider of vision you can have. Speaking in another way, the longer the focal length, the narrower the cross is, and then it will get you a narrower angle of view. Thus, focal length gives us such effect of viewing angle. And then two factors are further generated here. First is, a short focal length will probably let you have a wider vision than your naked eye. So it gets a magnified effect. Since after zooming out, the objects will be appeared smaller than you can perceive with your eyes. You will then have a much wider perspective, much wider than we can see in the real world. In opposite speaking, a long focal length will zoom in the things from far away, so it gets an enlarged effect. And that's what I said before, the various focal lengths just like a magic magnifier or magnifier. The second point is, when you are in short focal length, you will have a longer depth of field. And in opposite again, shorter depth of field will be get from a longer focal length. Since when you are in longer focal length, everything will be magnified and the distance between them will be much more crucial and precise. Okay, how does it actually achieve? Well, I don't know. But we are photographers and not a scientist. We just need to know and remember that when in short focal length, we get wider angle of view and longer depth of field, and narrower viewing angle with a magnified effect, as well shorter depth of field in long focal length. According to the above characteristics, the relationship of focal length to the scenario covered can be divided into 5 main categories. And ordinarily speaking, the standard is mainly based on the full frame format. For example, under 24mm, no matter there is 8mm, 10mm or 15mm, anything under 24mm could be termed as ultra wide angle. The range between 24 to 35 mm could be seen as wide angle, and 35 to 70 mm is a standard lens. Why there's a so-called standard lens? Of course, not because it gets a standard price or standard design. The reason is it is quite similar to our field of perceiving the world. Really, do we really get such a wide range of viewing angle? Of course not exactly, just a certain kind of field. Since we have a certain focus when we see, and actually our view of angle are quite wide, but since we use it to concentrate just on something, we actually cannot see the things from the two edges. Then it's just similar to the full frame focal length of 35 to 17 mm. And finally, it defines what is a standard focal length. And from 17 mm to 300 mm, it could be termed as telephoto, while those beyond 300 mm could be termed as super telephoto. The focal length could be roughly divided into these 5 categories. Sure, you must have known that if you are already a veteran, or try to remember that if you are a rookie. And then you may find that the kit lens from a full frame camera will always be a 24 to 17 mm zoom. It gives us a basic wide angle and also gives us a little bit telephoto. A very useful range, and that's why it's so common as a standard kit lens. And regarding the application of different focal length, it seems not very complex. For example, for a grand or a great field, or you are situating in a very small room and you want to see more, then you may use the wide angle lens. For a standard portrait, a standard focal length will easily help you to shoot a full or medium shot. When using a telephoto, of course, you are intending to get a certain decided target or effect. For example, flowers, birds, or close-up of a portrait. You will apply the telephoto to shoot. Here I want to talk about a few more terms for this topic: the view of angle, crop factor, and the equivalent focal length. What is view of angle? Actually, the angle of view is fixed for each lens, but adding to a different size or format will give you a different view of angle, and that's what we call the crop factor. A same lens with a fixed focal length used on different size or format will then give you different view of angle. Again, based on full frame format, APS-C will have a 1.5 times crop, and M4 gets a 2 times crop. Just remind that the crop will have an enlarged effect. For example, you get a certain field of view in full frame. Once the same lens is moved onto the M4, the correlated cross angle would then be decreased. So the field of view will also be narrower. That's what the crop factor stands for. Then, what does the equivalent focal length mean? In normal practice, there's slowly for us to lose this easy of matter. As I said before, as a hobby, we shoot films or photos for fun. We may not really concern what focal length we are using when filming. Or if you are already using a prime lens, you get certain decided effect as expected. Then you won't really care if there is any crop factor. But here I want to emphasize a point that a prime lens, for example, 20mm prime, it is forever a 20mm lens. It won't be changed to as another different focal length lens when swapping to another format. So make sure that the equivalent focal length actually means that we use the field of view from the full frame as a reference. But when you apply the same focal length to another format, for example, the 20mm again, if you apply a 20mm lens to the M4 the field of view is just as similar as the 14mm in full frame. And then, what is the meaning for us of knowing this? I repeat, no problem of not knowing this concept. Nevertheless, speaking from another angle. But for job, for example, for movie making, We have to think and prepare before of what lenses we would like to use. Then it is better for us to know this concept. Why? Since sometimes we have to match different formats or cameras during the shooting. So we have to make sure that our lenses could cover all the scenarios from different cameras. And due to this purpose, it is better for us to know the concept of equivalent focal length. And regarding the concept of equivalence, I will further discuss it later. Since concerning the final effect, this is meaningless for just dealing with the equivalent focal length. For the real equivalent, that means the final effect of matching with different formats. For example, an M4 or an APS-C image can really match the image from a full-frame format. And for achieving this, the factor of the aperture must be involved, and not just the focal length. But I will leave it for another day to discuss. As said before, using the same lens in different formats will give you different view of angles. It mainly affects the width of your view. A 24mm on full frame is already a wide angle, but when we put it on an M4 it will just similar to the effect of a standard lens on full frame. That means equivalent to the 48mm on the full frame. In reverse speaking, if you want to get an effect of full frames 24mm on the M4 then you have to use a 12mm lens. Yes, a very simple calculation. And of course, it develops another concept. For wide-angle images, it will be a bit easier for full-frame format to achieve since there are still a large range of focal length for choosing. For example, a 24mm is already a wide angle. Of course, it will be wider for using an 18mm. In the opposite, for M4 or a tiny format, you don't need a very super telephoto lens to achieve the same effect in full frame. For example, you have a 300mm lens, yes, 30cm, it's very long. It is a telephoto for sure, but the effect may not be so tele in full frame. But when you put this 300mm on the M4 it will similar to the effect of 600mm in full frame. The effect for sure is much more tele. And that's also why the real long-range zoom cameras, for example, 20x zoom, 25x zoom, or even 40x zoom, that must be a tightly censored camera. Just because there's no need to build a super long lens to achieve a very telephoto effect. And that's also what we may take into consideration that, for example, some people will use a full-frame camera for his 90% photos. But when he deals with telephoto, he wants to minimize the size of his camera and lenses. Then he will take out an M4 camera. Since a 150mm lens on the M4 can already achieve the effect of a 300mm lens on the full frame.